One of the things about the Sacco and Vanzetti story that really stands out in my mind is how many creative people were drawn to their story.
The 1940s was one of Woody's most prolific songwriting periods, and he was responding to the political repression of post-World War II America. It's a moment that parallels the early decades of the 20th century with the paranoia and suspicion of Reds. He was writing songs against the corruption of workers by big bosses. Virtually every song of Woody's is fighting for the working class, so it's no wonder that he became involved with documenting and memorializing Sacco and Vanzetti.
Sacco and Vanzetti were two Italian immigrants to the United States who came to the U.S. around the turn of the 20th century.
Vanzetti came from Villa Folletto. It's located in the Piedmont region in northern Italy. And Sacco grew up in Torre which is in the Puglia region. It's in the south, the deep south.
They were Italian immigrants at a time when Italian immigrants were held in contempt by a large part of the American population, and they were radicals.
They lived apart, not knowing each other until around 1917, when both joined an anarchist circle in East Boston, and that threw them together, and they went to Mexico with the group during World War I. And then 2 years later, they were accused of a crime, payroll bank robbery, in April of 1920, outside a bunch of shoe factories in Braintree. The payroll that was delivered every week to the workers was brought through the streets in an armed box carried by two guards, but it was brought in cash. And on one day, two men who had been seen all over town that day jumped the guards, gunned them down in the street, killed them both, and then a getaway car came from down the street, and they disappeared around a corner and were gone. Money was never found again. And about 3 weeks later, Sacco and Vanzetti were rounded up on a streetcar, and they were immediately arrested, and they never saw freedom again. And they were tried a year later and found guilty.
The two of them witnessed firsthand how the rich profited at the hands of workers, and these experiences charged their activism, where they started to believe in a future that privileged humanity over exploitation. And it was these beliefs that ultimately led to their arrest and eventual execution.
And their trial became a huge worldwide cause célèbre because they were both found guilty and sentenced to die by the electric chair. And that led to a 6 year process of appeals, during which their case caused marches all over the world. And they were finally executed in 1927.
There were all kinds of social movements that radicals, that people who wanted to make change turned to. There were socialists, and there were labor union folks, and there were anarchists. And anarchists believed that the government was always against working people, and that they envisioned a utopian ideal world in which people would share their resources and treat each other with kindness. Sacco and Vanzetti's group of anarchists were among folks who believed that the only way to achieve this was through revolution and through revolutionary violence. They became involved with a group that believed in overthrowing the government by force if necessary.
Anarchists killed President William McKinley. Anarchists killed the King of Italy. There were several other top officials in other countries that were gunned down. And so anarchists were really known as the terrorists of their time. And when it was found out that Sacco and Vanzetti were anarchists, which they freely admitted, they were just assumed they must have done this. They must have been guilty.
The anarchists realized that police were onto them, and they were trying to hide their literature and hide their things. And Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested, thinking that they were being arrested for anarchist activities. In fact, they were being accused of committing the kind of crime that they never would have committed. Killing two fellow workers delivering the payroll at a shoe factory, that was not what Sacco and Vanzetti were about. But they were nervous, and they acted suspiciously, and they were put on trial for murder and robbery, and the trial was spectacularly unfair. When Sacco and Vanzetti were put on trial, they were brought up in front of an Anglo-Saxon judge named Webster Thayer, who was almost a cartoon character version of a person who would be incredibly intolerant and prejudiced against these two Italian immigrants.
He sort of crossed the line in multiple ways, and just the bias of some of the court officials and the way that he handled himself outside of the court really calls into question the fairness of this trial, which is why we're talking here today.
In the 7 years between 1920, when they're arrested, and 1927, when ultimately they're executed in the electric chair, the movement starts to grow. I mean, by 1927, when it was clear that they had lost their appeals and they were on their way to being executed for crimes that they almost certainly did not commit, you had people marching all over the world. There were millions of people marching on behalf of these two men.
Woody was invited by Moses Asch, the founder of Folkways Records, in 1946 to, and I'm going to quote Asch, to record what actually happened, not the bullshit in the papers. So there's this impetus here to capture what happened, the details of the trial and its aftermath. And Woody composed 11 new songs between 1946 and 47. And I love this story of Woody because, as a researcher myself, I imagine Woody traveling to Boston and to other sites of the trial, like Braintree and Plymouth, and he had some books with him and he had his guitar. And I feel like this is the quintessential Woody. He had to experience for himself on the road what it was like to go to these places to then write Sacco and Vanzetti's story. Some of the songs are mournful, some of them are historical, some of them advocate action and revolution. So I want to quote Woody. In one of his journals, he wrote, "You are Italian and I am from Oklahoma. I saw the same vision that you did, and all of us Dust Bowl families saw your same vision. It is the one big union we all saw." He's recalling here the Industrial Workers of the World preamble, one big union. He's advocating for an international working class solidarity and to liken Okies with Italian immigrants, invites us to say your progressive politics can dissolve all the differences that separate us. It's about worker justice. He also pledged in a letter to them, and I quote, "I'm going to write your history all over again because the history of you two men is the pure and perfect reflection of the battle of the whole movement of labor." When Woody was hospitalized, having experienced Huntington's, he said even then that this album was the most important album that he ever worked on.